Chapter 1 goes over a variety of topics, including some historical perspective on sexuality, how it's been viewed clinically, especially the topic of homosexuality, looking at Freud's view of it, as well as others. And also it goes over the various perspectives researchers take toward studying sexuality. Sociologists, for example, examine sexuality by conducting surveys and examining how society at large impacts sexual behavior, sexual trends as they change over time. The feminist perspective often focuses on women and their sexuality. Notice these two things often go hand in hand. Sociocultural influences on women's sexuality, what is considered sexy, social cultural influences on what behavior is appropriate for women. You will see feminists very often finding social causes and social influences on behavior, probably a little more so than biological. The book points out researchers often point more to social influences in describing women's sexuality and biological influences describing males. We can also take an evolutionary approach in examining traits that may exist in either genders and how they are expressed and why they are there in the first place. We may, for example, look at differences in jealousy. Lately there's been some really interesting research in evolutionary psych. It combines both the social influences and the biological influences. Sometimes it's been criticized for being a little too biological. Sometimes, often it's been criticized for being very post hoc. I myself, I lean toward a evolutionary perspective because it does combine a lot of the biological and social influences. One of the core things I keep saying I want you to get out of the class is a richer understanding that both things are at play. If you think about it, if some trait has existed for a long time and is cross-cultural, it may end up establishing itself in our genetic code. The environmental influences often dictate over time what traits are most adaptive. We see this in physical strength. Men were typically the hunters. They would go out, so they would have killing animals or unfortunately each other. They'd have to then be bigger and stronger, whereas women were more caretakers. And this helps explain why we see the physical differences in men and women in terms of strength, height, and some other attributes. We can also see this probably in personality characteristics like how jealousy is expressed, as well as some cognitive influences. The book points out differences in mental rotation tasks, object identification, and complex scene. Chapter 4 goes over some gender differences. I'm not going to talk much about the physiology of the differences. You could definitely review that in the book. What I will talk about is the biological and social influences that determine people's behavior. There are definitely some social influences. Fathers are more concerned about their sons being heterosexual than women. Males tend to encourage more rough and tumble play in boys than women do, and buy gender-appropriate toys. However, notice there is some evidence that there are already inherent differences between boys and girls in their toy choice. Boys without social influence tend to pick guns to play with and cars, and girls choose to play with dolls and more domestic things. We even see this in monkeys. So a purely social model, I believe, really can't account for these differences. Monkeys aren't socialized to play, boy monkeys aren't socialized by their fathers to play with cars, and girl monkeys aren't socialized by their mothers or fathers to play with dolls. It seems to be a natural toy preference.
The book covers the fact that males tend to fight much more often than females, and the fighting tends to be about very specific topics. One of them being the fight over access to sex. Reproduction in various animal species. There's a alpha or bull male who generally gets access, and then the other less physically dominant males tend to have to sneak for sex or get it in various ways. The manner in which this, of course, varies across species, but the point is that the men will even fight, males of a species will fight to the death in order to gain access to sex. In humans, we see fighting over reputation. You need a certain level of reputation for being competent, for being dominant, domineering, to gain access to reproduction, as well as the need for resources. You need to secure resources. It helps you secure mates, as well as it provides for your offspring. The series Breaking Bad, my favorite quote out of that was when Gus mentions, as explained here, what does a man do, Walter? A man provides for his family. And a man provides. And what he does, even when he's not appreciated, when not expected or even loved, he simply bears up and does it because he's a man. I don't include this because I think that only men can provide, or some sexist notion, but I think there's an inherent evolution adaptive trait that men, is ingrained in men, that to be successful is a trait you need. You inherently provide for your family to basically make sure your genes and exist for the next generation, as well as caretaking. Notice women can also provide, and certainly do in this throughout history, but they also tend, historically, evolutionarily, have taken more care and have focused more on caretaking. This is not a commentary that one can't do the other, but again, you have to think about evolutionary adaptive traits as the software in our mind tends to be rather old. It's adapted and built upon largely a society and environment that no longer exists. We are no longer hunter-gatherers, which we were for hundreds of thousands of years, but instead many of these things are provided for us. However, our software in our brain does not change as quickly as we've been able to reconstruct our environment. So there's still some mental mindsets that exist there, would be an argument of evolutionary psychologists. In terms of evolution, one of the more puzzling things that existed for Darwin was a peacock. There's no functionality in terms of having this beautiful display for a male peacock, except to attract a female. But it's at a huge cost to the male, running around trying to live its life with this full plumage, as well as all the physical energy it takes to create such a display. Well, he answered that by researching and finding out that and then coming to the conclusion is that these displays of excess may be a valuable trait. I am so good off, I can not only show you a little, but I have so much it doesn't really matter, whatever that attribute is, and in this case it's health. In humans, we see other displays. Certainly, excessive displays may take the form of wealth. I can afford a Learjet and to buy my wife a Louis Vuitton purse, or right below that, a Tesla motor car, which is not only a display of wealth, but, for example, that I'm green. I'm socially positive, and we can see that a lot of ways that displays occur can be displaying I'm a good person. I can display the traits of being a good parent. And especially in areas like California, showing that you're green is a good way to maneuver into mates for males. Another example might be something like humor. It's a display of intelligence, your ability that you're socially adept. As an example, we see John Candy, a picture of him. If you didn't know who he was, I highly recommend the movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Very funny film. So he's the man with the jacket on. Right around unfortunately he passed away, but right around the height of his popularity, he was voted as one of the sexiest men alive. Not being attracted to men, I'm not sure if that's based on physical attributes, but I would guess a hunk of that was due to humor. He just seemed to be a nice, easygoing guy, very funny. Whether you find him attractive or not, the point is he was able to secure that position for multiple attributes, and humor is often argued as being a trait that males possess, potentially to a greater extent to females, as a way to try and attract mates. Notice, by the way, a lot of these ideas of evolutionary psychology are not particularly what we consider politically correct, but again, science should not operate on political correctness. It should operate on trying to find whatever truth there may be in the world. Finally, one of the last things I want to talk about is the fact that female generally controls access to sex. We see this across species, and the book points out, for example, in rats and mice, females, you cannot gain access to a female unless she performs lordosis. It's this arching of the back. That way the vagina is available to the male. And it's generally considered hormones control this process. So when the female is at prime time in her cycle to conceive, she will engage in lordosis, and the males are certainly willing to oblige. And we see this in other species, for example, displays in bonobos and other primates. The genital area becomes engorged with blood, and signals to the males of the species that they're receptive to sex. Women do not operate on this, but there has been several studies and recent research showing some hormonal influences. For example, a beautiful study performed showed that when women entered a bar, they took a saliva sample and took a photo of them, and an independent group then judged how sexy the women were dressed. And what they found is that when women were, again, in their peak reproductive point at their cycle, they tended to dress sexier. They tended to wear redder lipstick, shorter skirts, lower tops. Now, I doubt the women are consciously saying to themselves, wow, I think my egg is really, at prime time here. So it's probably more that this biofeedback loop is influencing their behavior sometime, to some capacity. I bring this up because this is one of the newer and hot topics in research, and one of the things I would love people to do is think about things they can study. For example, I wondered, can we measure women's alcohol consumption throughout their cycle and see if it peaks around then to lower inhibitions, self-induced lowering of inhibitions. Or, the confound there, unfortunately, is maybe men buy them more drinks due to the way they're dressed. Or if, for example, women tend to engage in more sexual behaviors at that time. Some of the studies looking at variations of behavior across ovulation have even shown that women will tend to have different purchasing and respond patterns, as well as respond to different ads based upon where they are in their cycle. This is going to end the first video over Chapter 1 and Appendix A. I hope you found it educational. If there's any feedback you'd like to give, I'm be happy to hear it.